Hi everybody, my name's Will.
And my name is Ellie.
Welcome to Lively Minds, the podcast about mental health challenges that go beyond the ebb and flow of the everyday.
The podcast that looks at how developing an understanding of our mental health influences how we address it.
In today's episode, we are exploring the evolutionary basis for anxiety. And we are delighted to welcome Professor Melissa Bateson from University of Newcastle to guide us through the conversation.
Melissa is Professor of Ethology at Newcastle University. Ethology is the science of animal behaviour. Melissa's research focuses on how stressful lifetime experiences can alter behaviour, cognition and biomarkers of health and well-being in a range of species, including starlings, macaques and humans.
Welcome to the show, Melissa.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we are recording two shows with you here in situ at Newcastle Medical School with Ellie beaming down the line to us from Manchester. Can you just start off by introducing yourself, explaining to us what ethology is, and just tell us a little bit about your work?
Hello, so I'm Melissa Bateson and I'm Professor of Ethology, as you said, here at Newcastle University. Ethology is the biological study of behaviour. So we're interested both in the mechanisms that underpin behaviour, but also the evolution of behaviour and the reasons we have the behaviours we have. And we're interested in both animals and humans. So ethologists have a reputation for studying animals, but really we're interested in all animal species, including humans. And I think of humans as just being another animal, really, a particularly interesting one perhaps, but we're all part of the evolutionary continuum. So we get a lot of our inspiration for thinking about humans from studying different species of animals.
Today we're talking about the evolutionary basis for anxiety. So our listeners are going to be familiar with the term anxiety within the context that we normally discuss it, which is contemporary human mental health. I just wondered if you could kind of explain anxiety from like an evolutionary perspective. Does it differ at all?
I suppose in humans we tend to think about the subjective experiences that go with anxiety, and that's how we measure it. We ask people how they feel. When it comes to thinking about animals, that's the one thing we can't do directly because they can't tell us how they feel. So we have to focus on other components of anxiety. So anxiety is a biological response that's designed to prepare us to detect and deal with threats we encounter. And as such, it has physiology involved. So there are hormones that are released when we're anxious. There are cognitive changes in how we process information, and there are behavioural changes as well. So this all makes up what we call anxiety as biologists, and everything to do with anxiety except the subjective feelings we can measure in other species. Humans can tell us how they feel, but animals can't do that directly. But we can measure the physiology, the cognition, the behaviour in all species.
Could you just tell us a little bit about the importance of anxiety within evolution in terms of survival?
It allows animals to prepare themselves to detect and deal with threats, and that could be threats of any kind, threats to survival, predators, lack of food, conspecifics wanting to fight you or for resources. So there's all sorts of threats that we and other animals face, and anxiety is a response that basically makes us and other animals more able to deal with those threats and less likely to be damaged by them. So animals that can deal effectively with threats are going to be the ones that survive. So there's been natural selection for responses that enable animals and humans to deal well with threat.
And I guess it's about both actual threat that's evident and also potential threat as well, isn't it? I know that I've heard psychologists talk about the bear in the bushes analogy, which is that idea of there might be a bear in the bushes, and so there's an anxiety response to the potential of something bad happening, and that's kind of distinct from there actually is a bear in the bushes and we have to react right now to that situation.
Yeah, I think what you need to understand is that our brains are always receiving cues from our environments and our bodies about possible threats to us. But a lot of that information is really ambiguous, and we won't know whether the rustle in the grass is just the wind or whether it's a lion waiting to pounce on us. So there's a lot of ambiguous information, and our brains have to try and decide whether any particular cue that we receive is evidence of a threat or if it's something completely benign. So, when you're walking along a dark street at night and there are footsteps behind you, somebody's approaching, you have to decide, should I leg it and run for home, or is it safe and I can just carry on walking and this person's just walking a little bit faster than I am and they'll pass me without any consequences, So you have to make those sorts of decisions all the time. Is this a threat or is it something benign that I can just ignore and carry on with my normal behaviour? And that's what our anxiety system is having to manage, where to set the threshold for setting off the alarms and saying, now it's time to fight or run away, versus just carry on.
This leads us into the smoke detector principle. Can you explain what that is to us?
So if we go back to this idea that you're receiving information all the time and you're not sure whether that's information about threats or whether it's something you can just ignore, the thing about threats is that if it is a threat, if it's a lion in the grass and it happens to pounce on you, the outcome for you is going to be really bad. So the costs of getting it wrong and ignoring a threat are huge in terms of your likely survival and fitness. Whereas the costs of a false alarm, so deciding to run away when there's not a lion there or a mugger behind you, are a little bit, but they're not as bad as missing a real threat. So there's this imbalance in the costs of the two mistakes that you can make. It's much more costly to make the mistake of ignoring a real threat than it is to make a false alarm and run away or mount an anxiety response when it's unnecessary.
So then is it the case that evolution has kind of favours that bias?
So evolution has favoured this bias in how we respond to potential threats. Better to be safe than sorry. I think that's the way to sum it up.
Yeah. Here we're getting on to where anxiety can start becoming a problem for humans and potentially for animals as well. Any animal, I guess, is where if that threshold for threat is too low, then there's the risk that whilst the cost might be less each time you worry about something for it not to actually transpire, the accumulative effect potentially of constantly, because of that low threshold, constantly becoming anxious about something and everything is going to build up and build up and build up, build up and build up and start to become a problem. So at what point do you think this response can start to become an issue?
So I suppose it depends what you mean by an issue. One thing I would have to say as an evolutionary biologist is that anxiety could be an issue in terms of being distressing for you as a person to experience without there being anything wrong with how you're responding to the situation. So it can be unpleasant without being maladaptive. These two things are separate. So if we think about, for example, pain, the function of pain is to protect the body when we've got injuries to it or to stop us burning ourselves or whatever, and it has to be unpleasant to have that function. Anxiety is a bit the same. It has to make us focus our attention on potential threats, stop us sleeping, make us ready to fight or run away, prepare the body for all of that. And a lot of that won't be very helpful or pleasant, but it's necessary if there are real threats around. So if you're living in an environment where there are a lot of threats and therefore your body's receiving a lot of information about threats, then you may be triggering your anxiety system a lot and feeling very anxious, but there's not necessarily anything wrong with it. It's a protective response and it's there for a good reason. It won't necessarily be pleasant and it might have long-term bad consequences for you, but it's there to protect you in the short term against threats. So it doesn't have to be broken in any way.
If it's somebody who has lots of stressors in their life, then the anxiety response itself is perfectly rational for that situation because that person has lots of stressors in their lives.
So I think if you're living in Gaza at the moment, it's very reasonable that you should be immensely anxious because your life is being threatened every single day on multiple fronts. Of course, it might be the case that your brain is appraising signals of threat that are not actually really threatening. So I think there are cases where people can misinterpret cues or overinterpret cues as cues of threat when they shouldn't be. And I mean, there are some interesting ideas around, exposure to the media, for example, that we see pictures of wars and famines and climate change, all sorts of threats every day. And that this might be having an impact on people because they're getting all of this information. That's not something we're used to from our evolutionary environments. And that could be triggering anxiety in people that's not really appropriate because those threats are distant and are not actually going to affect them. But we haven't evolved to receive, news from all over the world and deal with that in a good way. So, there are ways in which we could be being made more anxious by our current environment, I think, and the fact that we're bombarded with information about bad stuff going on in the world.
So in like a trauma-informed theoretical framework, we'd speak about hypervigilance, which is the state when you're almost like your senses are super, super sensitive to anything happening. And I was thinking from an evolutionary perspective, at what point would you consider anxiety to be maladaptive?
That's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I'm not really having to make those decisions. So I think that's where clinical psychology comes in a lot in the kinds of therapies that are useful for people. So trying to get them to alter their appraisals of how threatening certain things are, or what's the worst case scenario of what could happen to you if a threat does arrive. So that's where I think psychology can really come in to help people who've got the wrong ideas about how bad threats are or how likely they are.
Yeah, it's interesting, because as you said at the very, very outset, it all comes down to the cost of each response. So if there's something in our lives that makes us feel anxious, the evolutionary background to that is that the potential consequences of us just ignoring that thing could lead to death, could lead to really serious consequences. I guess that for a lot of people now, that cost analysis is shifting, because there are lots of things that, talking from a personal point of view, lots of things that I get anxious about that really don't have that same cost calculation.
Yeah.
It's actually that if this thing was to happen, it wouldn't be as disastrous as I'm thinking it will be.
Yes.
But that's maybe where things start to go a little bit wrong. And as you say, that's where we need to recalibrate our understanding of what the threat actually is and what its consequences might be.
Yeah, and obviously for dealing with people with phobias, for example, of dogs or something, you can treat them with gradual exposure. You can be with a dog and it doesn't attack you or bite you, and you'll realise that actually it's quite rare for dogs to attack and bite people. And that way you reappraise your preconceptions about how much of a threat a dog actually presents. So that makes total sense that that's going to work as a therapy.
I think for me, as somebody who has had issues with anxiety for a very long time, a previous guest was talking about how there's no such thing as an irrational response to something. Like, I was sort of having this conversation with her about how do I tell when an anxious thought, a worry, is irrational or not? And her response was kind of like, well, there's no such thing as an irrational response to something. We respond to a perceived threat. And so maybe, therefore, the issue is back one step, which goes back to the cost analysis that you talk about, which is, if I was to not respond to this threat, then what would be the cost of that? And if I was to respond to it, what would be the cost of that? And actually having a more balanced perspective on what that calculation actually is would then mean that the response would be accordingly modified. It would change according to how I calculated that threat. And so in a sense, perhaps, and this is just me speculating here, but perhaps in somebody who has what might be considered clinical anxiety, maybe that's the mechanism that needs some adjusting, the mechanism through which you're doing that cost analysis of responding to the anxious thought compared to not responding to it.
I think that, I mean, we're not assuming that calculation is done consciously by most animals. It's put there by evolution. But I mean, we could make it conscious in us and really try to think through, if we understand what the mechanisms are doing.
Yeah.
Could I actually address whether I think I've got these costs right or not?
And from a therapeutic point of view, it's quite interesting, again, just from my own experience. If I go and see a cognitive behavioural therapist, I've taken part in exercises where you are literally asked to analyse the chances of this thing that you're worrying about actually happening. So in a sense, I have done cognitive behavioural stuff, which is exactly about that. It's about making that, as you say, what would usually be an instinctive process, a far more conscious process. But it's also quite interesting that there's another sort of branch of cognitive behavioural therapy known as exposure response prevention, ERP, which is that it's actually not about spending time assessing whether, the extent to which we should be worrying about this thing or not. It's entirely focused on preventing the response to that fear. Now, the phobia example you gave before is a good example of that. So it's not so much that somebody is put into a room and it's explained why spiders aren't anything to worry about. It's that you have these gradual exposures actually to spiders so you can see for yourself that there's nothing to worry about. And so it's quite interesting that, obviously this is entirely layman's knowledge coming from me here. I'm not a psychologist either. This is just from what I've experienced from having gone through therapy and stuff, is that it's quite interesting that there's just two different approaches, but I'm seeing tie-ins with what you've been talking about in terms of from a biological point of view, what processes we are going through with animals.
I think that all makes total sense. I think a lot of the therapies that are addressing these things that we as biologists have identified are components of the system. I mean, I think where we need to be very careful is where people's anxiety is genuinely valid in that they are facing serious threats. So if you've got an abusive partner who might actually, in the worst case scenario, murder you, then it's probably really useful to be anxious, and to blunt that down with drugs or something could actually be a really bad treatment for that person, because it could cause them to actually not be anxious about something that they should be acting on. I suppose nobody ever seeks help for dealing with a lack of anxiety, but actually if you don't have any anxiety at all, there is some evidence that you're more likely to die in certain kinds of accidents because you're going to take risks that you wouldn't take if you had an appropriate anxiety response. So there are dangers to having reduced anxiety or no anxiety.
We'll get back to our conversation with Melissa very soon, but I'd just like to take a moment to firstly say hello to any new listeners who have dropped by, and to ask everyone listening right now, if you are enjoying the conversation and haven't done so already, could you do something for us? Could you pause the episode just for a moment and give us a rating or review in your podcast app? I promise we won't go anywhere. It really helps us to get your feedback. Done? Brilliant. Also, make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss future episodes, which we release once a month. Okay, now back to the show. Moving on next to the question of the threshold at which, from a biological perspective, an anxiety response should be set.
Going back to the idea of anxiety being like a smoke detector, it produces many more false alarms than it produces true hits. And that's just a feature of the design of a good anxiety system, because the costs of missing a true threat are so big. We've thought quite a lot about where is the optimum point to set your threshold for where you launch your anxiety response. So how should you set your smoke detector, as it were? And the right point to set it is determined by the probability of there being threats in your environment, so how likely threats are actually to occur. Obviously, the more threats there are in your environment, the more regularly you should trigger your anxiety response, because there are going to be more potential real threats out there that you should be responding to. So people living in environments where there are a lot of true threats should have a more active response and respond more easily to potential threats. So that would be people in war zones, people in abusive relationships. You can think of lots of situations where the probability of threats occurring is higher. But the other thing that should determine where you set your criterion for responding is how able you are to deal with a threat should it actually occur. So we call that your vulnerability. The sorts of things I'm thinking about here are how fast can you run? How physically capable are you of fighting or running away? And that's really interesting because it sort of suggests that there are certain types of people who would typically be more anxious. So they're going to be people who are physically weaker or disabled or sick, younger people, older people, women. These are all kind of groups that are more likely to be anxious, people who have got injuries or disabilities, who can't physically deal with threats. Also, people who are alone, so social support is hugely important in dealing with a threat. If you're walking on a dark street at night and you've got a friend with you, you're going to be much less anxious than if you're on your own, and that makes total sense from an evolutionary perspective. So we know that social support is hugely important in anxiety, and that loneliness is a predictor of poor mental health. So all of these sort of things feed into your vulnerability. So it's this combination of how probable threats are and how vulnerable you are to them that should determine where you put your threshold for launching an anxiety response to information that you're receiving from the environment. And I think that insight has been very helpful in thinking about which kinds of people are likely to suffer from anxiety. And also possibly, how you might treat it. So it makes some quite unusual, unconventional suggestions that you may be treating physical symptoms is sometimes going to be a really good way of addressing anxiety, that if you can make people fitter or more able to respond to a threat, then they may actually have less anxiety.
It kind of, through that paradigm, suggests that the way to alleviate the situation is to address those stressors, address the causes that are leading to that anxiety response, or equip people to be able to more resiliently respond to those stressors.
Yeah,
as well.
So I think the first one is addressing the probability. So if you can remove people from environments where there are so many threats, that should help. Where that's not possible, making them less vulnerable by equipping them to deal better with threats. So that's why probably things like physical exercise could be really beneficial for people with anxiety, becoming physically fitter. There's a clear sort of biological explanation there that sort of makes some sense, that you're allowing people to deal with threats better by making them fitter or stronger.
On that note, so I'm physically disabled, and in those situations that you described, then I find it really interesting because I didn't always used to mobilise with a crutches or a wheelchair. So since I have these additional risk assessment things in my head that happen when I'm like you say, walking on a street on my own or whatever it is. And I've noted that in recent years and been like, that's interesting. Perhaps I didn't used to worry as much because I was more confident that I could, whatever it is, run away or whatever.
Well, I think, that makes total sense to me, I think.
Yeah, it just reminded me that when I was about 16 or something, I started going to the gym for the first time. And I didn't need to. I was very, slim or whatever. I was 16. But as a result of starting to go to the gym, I lost lots of weight because I guess I didn't have that much to lose anyway. But I didn't feel stronger, and I felt so uncomfortable, so physically vulnerable because I'd lost weight that I stopped going, because it just, something made me feel really, I was like, why I feel skinny, I don't feel strong, this is weird, I don't like it, I don't feel safe. So I stopped going for that reason. I just wanted to say that because I always thought that was an odd thing to have done. But actually that makes sense.
I think to me it makes sense that you would have been less able to actually deal with threats if you lost strength, or were less physically imposing, I think.
Maybe.
Just being bigger could make you feel more confident in conflict situations.
We've touched on this very lightly in a couple of other conversations we've had in different podcasts, but not really gone into it. And I'm really, really interested to think more about it, which is about how the relationship between the evolution of our anxiety and how it plays a role for us, and the evolution of the threats that we face, which are obviously I say obviously, unfortunately, things like shelter and food insecurity are still very much threats for many people in the world now, as they were thousands of years ago. But how do you understand the different threats we face now that we're responding to with anxiety in the 21st century compared to how we developed these systems thousands of years ago?
That's a good point. So are the threats different, and is that partly responsible for why people are having more issues with anxiety today? I think, as I already mentioned, that exposure to media is something that I think could be really relevant. The fact that we're being bombarded with news all the time, that's because the threats are not actually directly relevant to people. They're removed in space or time from where we are. They're happening somewhere in the world, but they're not actually a threat to you in your front room watching your telly or looking at your phone or whatever it may be. But I think you're getting at something different. Is there something else that's different about the kinds of threats we face? And I don't know about that, to be honest. I mean, we know that there are some really nice studies done of animal species like the Belding's ground squirrel, which is a little rodent that lives in North America. And Belding's ground squirrels live all over the place, and in some populations they have a lot of trouble with predators, and in other populations they have much less. And in the populations that have a lot of predation, the squirrels have a much bigger anxiety-like response. They have much higher stress hormones from very early in life, and they're more vigilant and things. And this all makes total sense because they live under constant threat of predation to a much greater degree than the ones in other populations where they don't have as many predators. So that's just an example of where in a single animal species we've seen different populations evolve different levels to cope with different levels of threat in their environments. And presumably the ones with lots of predators have got chronic stress from this, and they've evolved anxiety to cope with that. So I don't know whether things are different in modern humans. I just know that in different populations of the same animal species, you see variation in how much stress they have to deal with, and it's probably the same for us too.
I guess I was thinking like in sort of ancestral ancient times when in our small community as a human, our main threat might be something similar, like more immediate predation, like sort of immediate, I guess, environmental, like a fire or something like that, when we were probably responding in a more similar way to the squirrel.
Yes.
As opposed to now, I just think the types of anxieties people have now, in addition to also having those, but things like job insecurity, inadequate housing, the kind of long-term, maybe less immediate threats that just sort of are there underlying.
I think it's possible that there have been changes there that are interesting, but I just don't know. As I say, I think many animals are also faced with similar sorts of situations where they may have issues with habitats being different or changing. I think my understanding of anxiety is the triggers are to do with uncertainty, and we'll always have had uncertainty in our lives. It may have come from different things, but I just don't know whether it's right to say we have more of that today than we used to have. I do believe that the media might be triggering things in people that they wouldn't previously have been exposed to. So I think that seems to be plausible. But is there more uncertainty about where food's going to come from or whether we're going to have roofs over our heads? I just don't know. Those things seem to have been pretty perennial problems for humans and other animals over evolutionary time to me.
Is there anything you think that humans could learn from other animals in terms of how we handle and deal with anxiety?
Absolutely. I started off working on birds, and I've ended up now working more on human emotions, anxiety and depression. And I don't know, I could never have predicted where I would have ended up from where I started. You know, I started off as a zoologist interested in animal behaviour, and I think I've sort of, by watching animals and thinking about them and trying to understand why they behave the way they do, it has really caused us to have some ideas about human mental health that have been quite different from what people had said before. So trying to sort of understand how the anxiety system is designed, and this isolation of the probability of threats and vulnerability to threats, and these being two separate things that should affect where your threshold for responding to a threat is. I think that has implications for thinking about how you might treat people and when it's appropriate to treat people indeed. So I think the evolutionary approach has been really, really valuable for me in terms of understanding why we have anxiety and when it's going to be worse and how you might manage that, and indeed whether you should manage it. So yes, I think the biological response is really, really valuable. We can learn a tremendous amount from other species without the baggage of all the things that are going on in our heads. You just watch them and try and understand their behaviour and make sense of it.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you for listening. As always, you can find us on social media at Lively Minds Pod.
Make sure you subscribe to Lively Minds wherever you get your podcasts and tune in again next month for another episode.
Please note that this show does not constitute medical advice and is not a replacement for seeking professional help. You can find signposting to support on our website, livelymindspod.com.
Take care and bye-bye for now.
Bye.